Hello, Landmark Youth. I hope you're having another exciting, entertaining week at home. I hope you're getting your schoolwork done if they're allowing you to do online classes. And I hope you were able to have some fun with the scavenger hunt that we did last week, the social distancing challenge that we had on Facebook. We saw a ton of really good entries, almost 200 entries in that contest. Some of them really funny, some of them really good and really creative. If you haven't already, go on Facebook and look at the collage video, the montage video that I did with pictures and videos from that scavenger hunt. Really entertaining. I'm really proud of you guys and saw a lot of good stuff. If you haven't seen this week's social distancing challenge, we are doing a positive vibes challenge. And so if you haven't seen the video on that, ask your parents about it. I put it on Facebook. I texted it out to them. We'd love for you guys to participate in that as well. So it is Wednesday, like I said, and so it's time for me to put out my devotional. And that is what we're going to be doing here in the next few minutes. And this one will probably be a little longer than the last couple devotions have been because, as you know, in the early part of this year, on Wednesday nights, the guys and girls were split, right? We were focusing on the roles and the responsibilities and the temptations that guys and girls go through individually. And so the guys, we were in Ken's song leading class, learning a lot of good information there. And you girls were getting taught by Darlene and Lisa and having a good time just being together as ladies. And so my goal was at the end of March, when the song leading class was over and we could get back together on Wednesday nights, my goal was to have a study centered around questions. And the questions start off with this phrase: how am I supposed to blank, right? And I was going to give you guys an opportunity, at least the first Wednesday of April, which would be today, right? That was going to originally be my plan, where we got together, we had a class, and we talked about some questions that you might have and you want me to address. Unfortunately, with the pandemic of the coronavirus going on right now, we still can't meet together. But I thought we'd go ahead and start this study anyways. And so the study for the next several weeks, probably till the end of the school year, the end of May, until summer starts, at least on Wednesday nights, it's going to be, how am I supposed to fill in the blank, right? We're going to have a different topic every week. And hopefully they're going to be things that you as junior high and high school students deal with on a daily, weekly, monthly, yearly basis. So we're going to kick that off tonight. Like I said, normally what I would do in this situation is meet with you guys for the first class period, talk about things you wanted to talk about in the coming weeks. But since we can't do that, I'll just have to decide for you. So tonight's lesson is going to be centered around, how am I supposed to treat my parents? It's a very interesting topic, and one that you as junior high and high school students probably have to deal with on a daily basis. How am I supposed to treat them when I'm mad, or when I'm sad, or when I'm happy, or when I'm annoyed or irritated, or just want to be left alone, right? We're going to look at that topic today, and hopefully you'll get something out of it that you can apply to your own lives. So how am I supposed to treat my parents? I think being teenagers, junior high and high school students, by now you probably know pretty much how your parents are supposed to be treated, right? We're supposed to love them, we're supposed to respect them, we're supposed to do what they tell us to do, we're supposed to kind of stay out of their way, not make them mad, right? Those are some of the things that our world might say about how to treat our parents. But a lot of times our world and our Bibles don't fully match up in every category. And so we're going to look at what the Bible tells us about how we're supposed to treat our parents. So if you haven't already, make sure you grab a Bible and we'll get started in our lesson today. So as we intro here, I want to talk about first the roles that God has designed for us in our houses and in our families. We had our gender roles event where we again split up guys and girls. And we talked about some of these God-given roles that each member of a family has to play, mainly centered around the different sexes, right? Guys and girls. And we already talked about, at least we did in the guys' version of the gender roles event, we talked about the roles of fathers, right? That men in the home are to provide for, to protect, to lead, and to teach, and to be present in the home, maybe to be a disciplinarian, a teacher, a guide. Fathers are responsible for those things, and they will ultimately have to answer to God on how they led their family in those respects. And mothers, of course, generally, for the most part, have roles of loving caregivers, ones who uplift and support and help maintain the household and raise the children. Now, this isn't to say that men do this and women do this and there's no overlap in between, right? Sometimes I do the dishes. Sometimes Megan takes out the trash. Sometimes I tuck Graham and put him in bed, tuck him in and put him in bed and give him kisses and hugs, right? There's really an overlap in a lot of this. But we are responsible for our individual roles as a whole. And so while we talked about the man's role and the woman's role in our gender roles event, the role we did not talk about is that of you guys as children. Right now in your homes, what are your responsibilities? Is it to just stay out of the way and not be seen or heard, and to just isolate yourself and do chores every once in a while and go to school and that's it? Now, God shows us in His Word the different roles that we have as children. Okay, so let's turn in our Bibles to Ephesians chapter 6. We'll look at one of those first roles right now. Ephesians chapter 6, we're going to look at verse 1 right now. And we're going to do a lot of flip in and turn in, so just bear with me and stick with me as we go through this, okay? The first role that we have as children, of course, is obedience. We are called by God to obey our parents. So look at the first verse in Ephesians chapter 6. It says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right." Now you notice that Paul, who originally wrote the book of Ephesians to the church at Ephesus, says we are to obey our parents in the Lord. Now normally if we were meeting together, I would ask you the question, what does he mean by that? In the Lord. And since we can't do that, I'll just tell you what he means. What Paul's trying to say here is that this is what the Lord desires, for us to obey our parents. Very simple. It's a simple concept intellectually. We understand it. It's a little bit harder to implement and to practice in our lives, though. But the Lord desires us to obey our parents and their instruction and their commands and what they want us to do. Okay? Look in Luke chapter 2, just several books back to the left. Luke chapter 2, still in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, chapter 2. Verses 41 through 52 give us an interesting account of Jesus as an adolescent boy, probably somewhere around the age of 12. In fact, verse 42 tells us that he was 12 years old. And Jesus had to travel with his parents every year to go back to Jerusalem for the feast of the Passover, right? And there's an interesting story here where he begins to get lost, but he's really not lost like he doesn't know where he is. He's lost in that he's not with his parents, and they end up traveling back to their homelands for several days, and they can't find Jesus. But of course, Jesus is sitting in the temple among the teachers, having discussion and instruction. So Mary and Joseph finally get back to Jerusalem and find him in the temple. And look in verse 51 of Luke chapter 2. There's an interesting phrase here that we as children in 2020 can apply to our own lives. Verse 51, it says, "After they had come back to Jerusalem to get him. And he went down with them and came back to Nazareth and was submissive to them." And his mother treasured up all these things in her heart. Verse 52. And Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. So even though Jesus was God in the flesh on earth, he was still a child. And he still had earthly parents to obey. So as children in 2020, we can follow Christ's example in submitting to our parents in the Lord, for this is right. Back to Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1. That last phrase there, in verse 1, it says, for this is right. Now, if obeying your parents is right, I think that would most easily imply that disobeying your parents is wrong. It is sinful. So let's go to another passage and see what happens when we disobey, maybe when we rebel. Okay? Go to 1 Samuel chapter 15. That's in the Old Testament. We're going to look at a passage here that really doesn't have to do with the relationship between parents and children, but it has a lot to do with obedience and disobedience. 1 Samuel chapter 15, we're primarily going to be in verses 22 through 23. But this passage right here, all of chapter 15 is a very interesting story when it comes to the importance of 100% obedience. So this passage is centered around the nation of Israel. And at this time, their king is King Saul, who was anointed by Samuel, who was instructed by God. Saul was chosen to be king of Israel. And God gives instructions for Saul through Samuel to go to battle against the Amalekites and to destroy them completely, wipe everything out. Verse 2 in 1 Samuel chapter 15 says, thus says the Lord of hosts, this is Samuel speaking on behalf of God, to Saul, I have noted what Amalek did to Israel in opposing them on the way when they came out of Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek and devote to destruction all that they have. Do not spare them, but kill both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. Saul is instructed to completely eradicate them from the face of the earth. Now, do you think he does that? Unfortunately, if you keep reading in the chapter, he does not. Verse 7, Saul defeated the Amalekites from Havilah as far as Shur, which is east of Egypt. He took Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive and devoted to destruction all the people with the edge of the sword. But Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep and of the oxen and of the fattened calves and the lambs and all that was good, and would not utterly destroy them. All that was despised and worthless they devoted to destruction. So essentially, Saul goes in and he annihilates everything that's bad about this civilization, right? He keeps the good cattle, the good oxen and sheep and goats, and he keeps alive the king. Now, if you notice, that is not exactly what God instructed him to do through the prophet Samuel. Verse 10 in 1 Samuel 15 says, the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I have made Saul king, for he has turned back from following me and has not performed my commandments. Yeah, he may have done part of what I instructed and commanded him to do, but he did not do all of what I instructed him to do. And if you keep reading there, Saul tries to make this argument like, well, I was keeping all the sheep and the cattle and the oxen, and I was keeping the good things for God. I was going to sacrifice them to God. And that just tells us right there, we may have good intentions for changing the instructions of our parents or for our authority figures, but if we don't follow them to a T, essentially we disobeyed. Okay? Now go down to the main point of the verse I want to, or the passage here that I want to read. Chapter 22. This is Samuel's response to Saul on behalf of the Lord. And Samuel said, has the Lord as great delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as he does in obedience to the voice of the Lord? In other words, would God rather have all these nice sacrifices, or would he rather have you just simply obey? The second part of verse 22, behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. I'd rather have you listen to my instruction than sacrifice all these animals to me. Verse 23, here's where we see rebellion come into play. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and presumption is an iniquity and idolatry. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, or failed to follow his instruction, he also has rejected you from being king. It is a pretty grave punishment for almost following all of God's commands, almost following his instruction entirely. But unfortunately, in God's eyes, in our parents' eyes, if you don't follow instructions 100%, you basically didn't follow them at all. God gave Saul specific instructions, but unfortunately he rebelled, and he lost the kingship of Israel because of that. Because soon after this passage, in fact, in chapter 16, David is anointed as king to usurp Saul. Now go to Colossians chapter 3, verse 20. We see some more insight about what it means to obey our parents and why it's important. Back to the New Testament, Colossians chapter 3, verse 20. Colossians chapter 3, verse 20. The passage reads, children, obey your parents. There's that instruction again. In everything, for this pleases the Lord. When children obey their parents, the Lord is pleased. And this command is taken very seriously in the Old Testament. In Deuteronomy chapter 21 and even again in Proverbs 30, you see the severe consequences of even stoning or death for children who do not heed their parents' instructions. But we can be thankful that our Christian parents in 2020 don't live under the strict law of the Old Covenant, but they live under the grace and the mercy of the New Covenant because of Jesus' sacrifice. But even if our parents aren't going to stone us or kill us when we don't follow their instruction, disobedience is not to be taken lightly, because not only are we called to obey our parents, but we'll see in Ephesians 6 chapter 2, Ephesians 6 verse 2, we're also called to honor our parents. Go back to Ephesians chapter 6 verse 2. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise. And you'll remember back to Exodus chapter 20. Honoring your father and mother is one of the 10 commandments. And I read a commentary when I was putting this lesson together that says to honor implies to love, to regard highly, to show the spirit of respect and consideration. And I thought that was a very good definition or commentary on what honoring your parents means. So therefore, when you obey and you honor, it has to be done in love and respect and not begrudgingly, full of complaint, because then it won't mean as much after you do it if you're complaining the whole time. And back to Ephesians 6, 2 and 3, it says that this is the first commandment with a promise. Then you pick up in verse 3, that promise is that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Or some of your versions might say live long on the earth. And this promise is true in general, but of course there are often exceptions to this rule, right? Jesus was 100% submissive and obedient to his parents, but he didn't live too long on this earth, right? He was crucified after he was beaten and arrested and tried. But the children who love and respect their parents are more likely to benefit they're more likely to live long on this earth because of their obedience to God's instruction. And they're really likely to benefit from their parents' wisdom, which usually comes from their experience, right? Your parents usually give you instructions to teach you something, or to keep you safe from something, or to protect you from something, right? So you get to benefit from their wisdom when you follow their instructions. But when you disobey your parents, you get their wrath and you get God's wrath. Both will be displeased with your disobedience and rebellion. I don't know if your parents have ever told you this or you heard them tell another parent this, but when I was growing up, if I got in trouble at school, not only would I get detention or SWATs or have to run or get suspended or whatever, but I'd get another punishment when I got home from my parents, right? Well, the same is true when it comes to disobedience to our parents. We get their wrath, their punishment, their disappointment, and God's disappointment. Our duty to honor and respect our parents doesn't end when we leave our home, though, right? It continues. When our parents get older and we grow up and have families of our own, when we become children that are grown up and adults, we still have the duty to love and honor and respect our parents. And this moves us into our last point. We're responsible for supporting our parents. And this is a concept taught by Jesus in Mark chapter 7, verses 6 through 13. And he's exposing the hypocrisy of the Pharisaical traditions. Let's turn there. Mark chapter 7. Remember, the Pharisees were a group of very legalistic or very strict Jews. And sometimes during Jesus' ministry, they were trying to trip him up or ask him questions that would make him contradict the law of Moses. Therefore, they could arrest him quicker. Mark chapter 7, verses 6 through 13. And he said to them, well, did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written? This people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching as doctrine the commandments of men. You leave the commandment of God and hold to the tradition of men. Verse 9. And he said to them, you have a fine way of rejecting the commandment of God in order to establish your tradition. For Moses said, honor your father and your mother, and whoever reviles father or mother must surely die. But you say, if a man tells his father or his mother, whatever you would have gained from me is Corban, that is, given to God, then you no longer permit him to do anything for his father or mother, thus making void the word of God by your tradition that you have handed down, and many such things you do. And the command to honor your parents implies care by adult children. When you leave your house and your parents grow old, it's still your responsibility, according to God's instruction, to care for and support your parents as they did you when you were a child in their home. And so our duty to love and respect and honor and care for and support our parents never ends. All the way to the end of their life is when it ends. And Paul teaches this same teaching in 1 Timothy chapter 5, verses 3 through 8, and then on to 16. He talks about it when he's teaching for the care of widows, right? It says that as children and grandparents, we are to repay our parents and grandparents. And if we don't do that, when we fail to do that, it denies the faith and makes us worse than an infidel. Paul teaches us in 1 Timothy chapter 5. So as we look at the duties and responsibilities of children in our homes and in our families, it's pretty clear from what we see in Scripture. Our duties are to obey, our duties are to honor, and our duties are to support and care for. And the home, where husbands and wives fulfill their duties to each other and within the family, and the home where parents and children fulfill their duties to each other and within their family. is going to be blessed. And even though this isn't a very common concept in our society in 2020, these homes that God describes for us are a common occurrence when God's instructions are taken seriously by every member of the family. And these homes should be very common within the Lord's church, where parents and children fulfill their roles and where husbands and wives fulfill their roles. And if we perform our roles within our families as God instructed us to do, we're more likely to make a greater impact on our society. We're more likely to stay together in the long term. We're more likely to have more fruitful and meaningful and loving relationships. And we're more likely to receive blessings from God solely based on our obedience and our following of His instructions and commands. So in closing, I want to read one more passage from Proverbs chapter 6. Verses 20 through 22. Proverbs chapter 6, verses 20 through 22. My son, keep your father's commandment, and forsake not your mother's teaching. Bind them on your heart always. Tie them around your neck. When you walk, they will lead you. When you lie down, they will watch over you. And when you wake, they will talk with you. So guys, as you go throughout your week, make sure that you're honoring and you're obeying and you're respecting and you're supporting and you're loving your parents. That's your role as children. Your responsibility is not their role as parents and spouses. Your role and what you can control is you. And if I was going to do a note card for this lesson, I would say this. God has clear instructions for children to obey, honor, and support their parents. Of course, that's from Ephesians chapter 6. I hope you guys got a lot out of this study today. Make sure you're using these characteristics when you address and interact and live with your parents. So if you've got an idea on another topic you'd like to talk about, how am I supposed to blank? You fill in that blank. Send me an email, text it to Megan, call Megan, however you want to get it to us, and I'll make sure that we do a lesson centered around that topic. Remember, guys, don't forget our social distancing challenge for this week. #LCOC positive vibes. Okay? Find the video on Facebook. Find the video that your parents had texted to them. Find out what to do and do it. We hope you guys have a really good week, and make sure that you stay safe and that you stay entertained and not too bored. And make sure that you get some time in the Word this week. Okay? Spend some time in this. There's a lot of good instruction for your life right in here. We love you guys. We're praying for you, and we'll talk to you next week. All right. See you later.